What drives a person to leave the warmth of hearth and hall for the bite of winter seas? What secret knowledge allowed Viking seafarers to navigate through ice-choked waters when even the sun seemed to abandon the world? And how did ordinary sailors endure months aboard creaking ships, watching their breath freeze in the rigging while the ocean whispered its ancient, dangerous songs? Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the northern seas, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, others just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between. I treasure seeing how far our circle of time travelers reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We're drifting back nearly 1,000 years to a time when the line between sea and ice blurred like a half-remembered dream, and when survival depended not on grand heroics, but on the steady rhythm of small, careful actions repeated day after day. Tonight, you'll slip aboard a vessel where frost etches silver patterns on weathered wood, where the ocean hums its winter song beneath a thin skin of ice, and where ordinary people performed extraordinary acts of endurance simply to see another dawn. It's midwinter, somewhere between the grey coastlines of Norway and the drifting ice sheets of the Barents Sea. You wake before the grey light rises, not because you choose to, but because the cold has worked its way through your woolen cloak and into your bones, making sleep impossible. The ship rocks with a different rhythm now than it did in summer. The waves are heavier, more deliberate, as if the sea itself has grown thick and sluggish with the cold. Around you, the Nar, this sturdy trading vessel that has carried you through countless voyages, creaks with sounds you've learned to read like a familiar language. The oak planks groan as they flex against the swells. The rigging above your head ticks and whispers as ice crystals form along the ropes, then break away with each gust of wind. Every surface you can see is touched with rime, a delicate, silver-white coating that makes the ship look beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. You push yourself upright from where you've been sleeping, wedged between a coil of rope and the ship's low gunwale. Your muscles protest, not just from the cold, but from the way you've had to curl your body to conserve warmth through the long, dark hours. Your wool tunic, once soft against your skin, has grown stiff with salt and moisture. It crackles softly as you move, like old parchment. The sealskin cloak you've wrapped around yourself has kept the worst of the wind at bay, but dampness has crept in everywhere, through the seams, around the edges, into your very marrow. The deck beneath your feet is treacherous with a thin layer of ice. Not the thick, solid ice of a frozen pond, but a slick, almost invisible coating that makes every step deliberate. You've learned to move with careful precision, testing each foothold before trusting it with your full weight. One careless moment, one slip, and you could find yourself sliding toward the rail. And in these waters, in winter, falling overboard is not a misfortune. You survive. Around you, your crewmates are stirring with the same reluctant awakening. Bjorn, the grizzled sailor who's made this voyage a dozen times before, sits hunched over his oars, working tallow into the leather wrappings on the handles. His breath forms small clouds that dissipate quickly in the wind. Eric, barely out of boyhood but already hardened by 2 seasons at sea, scrapes frost from the bronze fittings with a bone knife, his movements mechanical and patient. The ship itself is a marvel of adaptation to these harsh conditions, though you've long since stopped marveling and simply learned to work with its limitations. The Nar sits low in the water, its shallow draft designed for navigating rivers and coastal shallows. But this same design means that in heavy seas, waves wash over the gunwales with regularity. Your feet are never truly dry. The bilge water sloshes with a rhythmic sound that you've heard in your dreams, a liquid metronome marking the passage of endless hours. Every rope, every piece of rigging, every fitting on the ship has been treated with animal fat to prevent the worst effects of ice formation. But still, frost gathers. Still, metal grows brittle. Still, your hands stick to iron fittings if you're not careful, leaving skin behind when you pull away. You've learned to keep strips of wool wrapped around your palms, not for warmth, though they help with that, but to keep your flesh from adhering to the tools of your trade. The morning's first task is always the same: bailing. Through the night, seawater has found its way into the hull, through the gaps between planks, through the small spaces where the ship's constant flexing has worked the caulking loose. The water in the bilge is never truly clean. It carries with it the detritus of weeks at sea. Fragments of rope, crumbs of hardtack, the occasional scales of fish from meals long past. But it must be removed bucket by bucket, in a ritual as essential as breathing. You take your turn at the bailer, a leather bucket sewn with sinew, waterproofed with pine pitch that has turned black and hard with age. The water you scoop is shockingly cold, cold enough that it numbs your hands through the wool wrappings within moments. Each bucket must be lifted carefully to the rail, then emptied overboard without losing your balance on the icy deck. It's mindless work, repetitive work, but it's also meditative in its rhythm. Scoop, lift, empty, return. Scoop, lift, empty, return. The pulse of survival reduced to its most basic elements. When your stint at bailing is finished, you move to the next necessity: checking the rigging. Every rope, every line, every stay must be inspected for signs of wear or ice damage. The hemp ropes have absorbed moisture from the spray and fog, then frozen, then thawed, then frozen again in an endless cycle that makes the fibers brittle. You run your hands along each line, feeling for the telltale roughness that indicates breaking strands. Where you find damage, you must splice in new rope, a delicate task when your fingers are stiff with cold and the ship is rolling beneath you. The sail, when deployed, becomes a canvas for ice formation that transforms it into something sculptural and strange. Ice crystals grow in delicate patterns along the wool weave, creating geometric designs that would be beautiful if they weren't also dangerous. Too much ice accumulation and the sail becomes too heavy for the mast to bear. Too little attention to ice removal and the sail can tear under the uneven stress. So you scrape and brush and knock away the accumulation, working section by section while the ship continues its steady progress through waters that seem to grow more viscous with each passing day. The oars require constant attention. In summer, rowing is hard work but straightforward. In winter, each oar becomes a tool that fights against you. The wooden shaft grows slippery with condensed breath and spray. The blade accumulates ice that changes its weight distribution, making each stroke unpredictable. The oarlocks, bronze fittings that guide the oar's movement, must be cleared of ice regularly or they'll seize up entirely. You've developed a rhythm for this. Stroke, stroke, lift the oar, bang it against the ship's rail to knock away the ice, return to rowing position. Your shoulders burn with the repetitive motion, but stopping means the ship loses way, and in these waters, momentum is safety. Food becomes a cruel meditation on scarcity and preservation. The supplies you loaded weeks ago, barley cakes wrapped in oiled cloth, dried fish strung on sinew, wheels of hard cheese sealed with wax, have transformed into something barely recognizable. The barley cakes crack like pottery when you try to bite them. The dried fish has absorbed so much salt from the spray that it makes your mouth pucker and your throat burn. The cheese has developed a rind so hard you need a knife to chip away edible portions. But you eat what you have because the alternative is unthinkable. Each meal is rationed not just for quantity but for the energy required to consume it. Chewing frozen bread is work. Softening dried meat in your mouth until it's possible to swallow requires patience you don't always possess. Sometimes you hold food inside your tunic against your body, waiting for it to warm enough to be manageable. The simple act of eating becomes another task in the endless list of tasks that define each day. Water, or rather the lack of fresh water, presents its own challenges. The barrels of ale you brought have developed a skin of ice on their surface each morning. Breaking through this ice, ladling out your ration, becomes a ritual of small violence. The ale itself has grown stronger as water has frozen out of it, leaving behind a liquid that burns your throat and warms your belly with more force than you remember from shore. But it's liquid, and liquid is life, so you drink what you're given and try not to think about how much remains. Sleep, when it comes, is never complete. You doze in snatches, propped against whatever support you can find, wrapped in whatever dry cloth remains to you. The ship's motion never stops, so your body never fully relaxes. Even in your deepest moments of rest, some part of your mind remains alert to changes in the ship's rhythm, to alterations in the wind's voice, to the subtle variations in creaking and groaning that might signal trouble. You dream of warmth, of hearth fires and steaming bowls and the weight of fur blankets, but you wake always to the same reality of cold wood and colder water. The social dynamics of the ship take on a particular quality in winter. Tempers that might flare in summer are dulled by exhaustion. Arguments that might escalate become muttered complaints. The hierarchy that governs the ship, captain, experienced sailors, newer crew members, softens into something more collaborative. Everyone's survival depends on everyone else's competence. The captain may give orders, but he also takes his turn at the bailing bucket. The newest crew member may be assigned the worst tasks, but he's also taught the skills he needs to keep himself and others alive. Conversations, when they happen, tend toward the practical. How much ice has formed on the port rigging? Is the wind shifting? Should we reef the sail before the next squall arrives? But sometimes, in the quiet moments between tasks, talk turns to home. To the hall with its central fire and the benches lined with furs, to the smell of bread baking and ale warming by the hearth, to wives and children and the promise of spring. These conversations are soft, almost whispered, as if speaking too loudly about warmth and comfort might somehow make them more distant. The nights are the hardest. When the sun disappears, and at this latitude, in this season, it disappears for hours that stretch like days, the cold settles over the ship like a living thing. You huddle with your crewmates, sharing whatever warmth your bodies can generate. Someone might tell a story, voiced low and rhythmic, to pass the time and distract from discomfort. The old tales take on new meaning out here. Stories of giants and monsters and the long winter that will end the world don't seem like fantasies when you're surrounded by ice and darkness and the endless whisper of frigid wind. You learn to recognize the subtle signs that distinguish different types of cold. There's the dry cold that comes with clear skies and makes your nostrils stick together when you breathe. There's the wet cold of fog and spray that soaks through everything and seems to settle in your joints. There's the wind-driven cold that finds every gap in your clothing and makes even the smallest exposed skin feel like it's burning. Each type requires different strategies, different preparations, different ways of moving and working. And ice becomes both enemy and ally. Ice on the rigging is dangerous weight that threatens to tear the sail or snap the mast. But ice on the deck provides traction when spread with ash or sand. Ice forming on the ship's sides can protect the wood from the worst impacts of floating debris. Ice in the water can provide a windbreak, creating patches of relative calm in otherwise rough seas. You learn to read ice the way you once learned to read waves, as a language that tells you about conditions you can't yet see. The rhythm of the days blurs together. Wake before dawn, bail the ship, check the rigging, row when the wind fails, eat your ration, maintain your gear, sleep when exhaustion overwhelms discomfort, wake again. Each day is nearly identical to the last, but small variations keep you alert. Today the ice is thicker on the port side. Today the wind comes from a slightly different quarter. Today someone spotted what might have been a seal or might have been driftwood in the distance. Your hands become maps of this experience. Calluses form in new places as you adapt to ice-slicked tool handles. Small cuts refuse to heal in the constant moisture. Your knuckles crack and bleed from the repeated expansion and contraction of freezing and thawing. You rub them with tallow when you remember, but mostly you simply accept that pain is part of the price of passage through these waters. And always, there is the awareness that you are very small and the sea is very large. The ship that seemed so substantial when moored at a familiar dock becomes a fragile shell when surrounded by the endless grey of winter ocean. The waves that lift and drop you with mechanical regularity could, with just a small change in their pattern, overwhelm your vessel entirely. The ice that decorates your rigging with such beautiful patterns could, if the temperature dropped just a few more degrees, lock your ship in place until spring, if you live to see spring. But you endure because endurance is what humans do. You wake each morning because sleep ends and consciousness returns. You perform your tasks because tasks must be performed. You eat your rations because hunger compels you. You share the small warmth of your body with your crewmates because isolation means death. You continue, stroke by stroke, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, across waters that have claimed countless ships and countless lives, toward a destination that grows no closer with each passing day, but remains, always, the promise that keeps you moving forward. The sea hums beneath the hull with a sound like distant singing, and you close your eyes and let that sound carry you toward whatever rest is possible in a world made of water and wind and the endless, patient work of survival. As the grey light fades into the deeper grey of evening, let us shift our attention from the anonymous struggles of ordinary sailors to the story of one man whose name has survived the centuries. His tale reaches across time like a voice calling through fog, telling us of journeys into waters so remote that even other Vikings considered them legendary. His name was Ottar, though the English scribes who recorded his words spelled it Ohthere. He lived in Halogaland in the far north of Norway, where the land grows thin and the sea grows wide, where the sun disappears for months in winter and barely sets in summer. Ottar was not a common sailor like those we've been watching struggle with ice-crusted ropes and frozen rations. He was a chieftain, a man of property and standing, owner of reindeer herds and fertile lands that stretched along the fjords. But wealth, it seems, was not enough for him. Picture him in his hall on a winter evening in the year 890 or thereabouts. The fire burns bright in the central hearth, and the smoke rises through the opening in the roof to join the aurora flickering green across the northern sky. His retainers sit on benches along the walls, working on weapons and tools by the firelight. The smell of roasted meat and fermented mare's milk fills the air. Outside, the wind carries the scent of snow and the distant sound of waves against ice. This is comfort. This is security. This is the life that most men of his standing would guard jealously and never willingly leave. But Ottar's gaze keeps drifting toward the shuttered windows, toward the darkness beyond, toward the unknown waters that stretch northward into regions no civilized man has mapped. The merchants who come to trade for his furs tell stories of lands beyond the edge of the world, places where strange peoples dwell, where the sea turns white as milk, where creatures exist that have no names in any human tongue. Most men would dismiss such tales as fantasy. Ottar listens with the focused attention of someone planning a journey. He is not young when he begins his most famous voyages. Grey threads his beard, and lines mark the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into northern winds. His hands are scarred from handling ropes and weapons, marked by the small accidents that accumulate over a lifetime of physical work. But his body remains strong, and more importantly, his mind remains curious. Curiosity in a man of his position is both a luxury and a danger. He can afford to indulge it because his wealth provides him with ships and men and supplies. But indulging it means leaving safety behind for the sake of knowledge that has no immediate practical value. When Ottar begins planning his voyage beyond the Arctic Circle, into waters that remain frozen for most of the year, his preparations reveal the methodical mind of someone who understands that survival depends on details. He selects his crew not just for their sailing skills, but for their ability to endure cold and uncertainty. He chooses men who have hunted in the deep forests during winter, who know how to read weather signs, who can maintain their equipment when metal grows brittle and wood grows fragile. The ship he outfits for this journey is larger than the Nar we've been aboard, but built along similar principles. Oak planks sealed with pine pitch, a single mast carrying a square sail woven from the finest wool, oars for when the wind fails or when precision navigation is required. But Ottar's vessel carries modifications that speak to the unique challenges of Arctic voyaging: extra caulking between the planks, double layers of seal-fat waterproofing, compartments lined with fur to store the most essential supplies where they'll have some protection from moisture and cold. The cargo he loads tells the story of his intentions: dried fish and smoked meat, but also honey and butter, luxury foods that will provide energy in the most demanding conditions. Woolen cloaks, but also sealskin garments sewn by the women of his household using techniques learned from Sami traders. Iron tools and weapons, but also bone needles and sinew thread for repairs that will be needed far from any harbour. Most tellingly, he brings trade goods: amber from the Baltic shores, silver arm rings hammered by skilled smiths, bolts of fine cloth dyed with expensive pigments. These are not the supplies of a man planning merely to survive his journey, but of someone who intends to meet other people and establish relationships that will outlast a single voyage. Imagine yourself as one of Ottar's crew members, standing on the deck as the familiar coastline of Halogaland falls away behind you. You've sailed these waters before, but never so far from home, never with the intention of continuing past every landmark you recognize. The captain stands near the steering oar, his eyes fixed on the horizon ahead, and you can see in his posture the weight of responsibility he carries. Your life, and the lives of every man aboard, depend on his judgment, his knowledge, his ability to read conditions that none of you have experienced before. The first days of the voyage follow patterns you know. The ship makes good time with favourable winds, the crew settles into familiar rhythms, the coast slides by with its succession of headlands and fjords and islands. But gradually, the landscape begins to change. The mountains grow lower and more barren. The forests thin and disappear entirely. The very quality of light seems different, cleaner and harsher, as if filtered through crystal. Then you pass the last headland that appears on any map you've ever seen, the final landmark mentioned in any sailing direction you've ever heard recited. Beyond this point, everything is conjecture and rumour and hope. The water ahead stretches unbroken to the horizon, grey-green under an overcast sky, marked only by the occasional ice floe, drifting like a pale island in the swells. Ottar's voice cuts through the sound of wind and water as he calls out course corrections to the helmsman. His tone is calm, conversational, but you can hear the underlying tension. He's navigating now by dead reckoning and intuition, by the angle of waves and the color of clouds on the horizon and the flight patterns of seabirds. Every decision carries consequences that won't become apparent for days or weeks. A course correction that seems minor now could mean the difference between finding land and sailing into empty ocean until your supplies run out. The cold intensifies as you travel north, not the familiar cold of a Norwegian winter, but something more fundamental, as if you're sailing toward the source of all cold in the world. Ice begins to form on the rigging earlier in the day and thickens faster during the night. Your breath becomes visible even at midday. The water itself seems to grow more viscous, more reluctant to part before the ship's bow. But Ottar drives forward with a persistence that borders on obsession. When ice threatens to block your passage, he orders the crew to break out the oars and row through the narrowest channels. When fog reduces visibility to mere yards, he maintains course based on compass directions that exist only in his head. When food runs low, he reduces rations rather than turning back. You begin to understand that this journey has become something more than exploration for him. It has become a test of will, a challenge that he must meet regardless of the cost. The Finns, when you finally encounter them, appear like figures from a dream. Their reindeer skin boats seem to materialize out of the mist, paddled by people whose faces are burned dark by wind and sun, whose eyes hold the particular alertness of those who live always on the edge of survival. They watch your approach with cautious interest, these people who have never seen a ship of your design, who speak a language that sounds like wind through ice caves. Ottar's diplomatic skills prove as valuable as his navigation abilities. Through gestures and the few words of their language he's learned from Sami traders, he establishes that your intentions are peaceful, that you come seeking trade rather than conquest. The negotiations that follow are conducted in a mixture of sign language and broken phrases, but gradually agreements emerge. Furs in exchange for iron tools, walrus ivory in exchange for amber, information about the lands ahead in exchange for silver arm rings that gleam like captured sunlight. From the Finns, Ottar learns of the Beormus and other people living even farther east at the shores of what you will later know as the White Sea. The description they provide is tantalizing, a settled people skilled in metalwork and boat building, possessing furs and ivory of qualities unknown even in the wealthy trading centers of Norway. But the journey to reach them requires threading through waters that remain frozen most of the year, following coastlines that shift with the seasons as ice advances and retreats. You see the moment when Ottar makes his decision. He stands at the ship's rail, staring eastward toward waters that appear empty but might hold wonders beyond imagining. His weathered hands grip the wood with white knuckles, and you can almost hear his thoughts weighing risks against possibilities. Behind him lie familiar waters and certain safety. Ahead lies the unknown, with all its promises and dangers. The decision, when it comes, surprises no one who knows him. The journey continues. The ship turns eastward, following coastlines that exist on no map, through waters that have no names in any language you speak. Days blur together in a routine of sailing and rowing and constant vigilance for ice. The sun, during the brief periods when it appears through the overcast, hangs low on the horizon, providing light but little warmth. When you finally reach the lands of the Beormus, the people you encounter seem almost mythical in their adaptability to this harsh environment. Their settlements hug the shoreline like barnacles, built low and sturdy to withstand winds that can strip the hide from an inadequately prepared animal. Their boats are works of art and engineering designed to navigate waters that transition seamlessly from liquid to solid and back again. Their knowledge of ice and weather and the movements of Arctic animals represents generations of accumulated wisdom. The trade that follows is unlike anything in your experience. These are not the hurried transactions of a busy harbour, but careful negotiations that unfold over days and weeks. Each item offered is examined with the attention usually reserved for sacred objects. Values are established not just in terms of immediate utility, but based on the rarity and difficulty of acquisition. A piece of amber might be worth a year's supply of fish oil. A well-made iron knife might purchase enough furs to keep a household warm through an entire winter. But perhaps more valuable than any trade goods are the stories and knowledge that pass between your peoples. Through interpreters and careful demonstration, the Bjormas share techniques for surviving in conditions that would kill most men within hours. Methods for reading ice conditions, ways of preserving food that remain edible after months of storage. Techniques for crafting tools and weapons from materials available in the Arctic. Ottar absorbs this knowledge with the intensity of someone who understands its value. He watches as Bjorma craftsmen demonstrate their methods for waterproofing boats with combinations of pine pitch and seal fat. He observes their techniques for hunting sea mammals through holes in the ice. He memorizes their songs and stories, understanding that these contain navigation information encoded in forms that can be remembered and passed down across generations. The return journey tests everything you've learned. The route that seemed challenging during the voyage out now appears familiar, almost routine. But familiarity breeds a dangerous complacency. Ice conditions have changed during your stay with the Bjormas. Channels that were open when you passed through them going east are now choked with pack ice. Landmarks have disappeared under snow. Weather patterns have shifted in ways that make your carefully memorized navigation techniques unreliable. Ottar's leadership during this return becomes the stuff of quiet legend among the crew. When the ship becomes trapped in ice, he organizes work parties to cut a channel back to open water. When food supplies run dangerously low, he implements rationing systems that keep everyone alive without destroying morale. When younger crew members begin to panic as familiar coastlines fail to appear when expected, his calm confidence provides the stability that keeps the expedition from falling apart. But you can see the cost of this leadership in the lines that deepen around his eyes, in the way his shoulders gradually bow under the weight of constant decision-making. Every choice he makes affects not just his own survival, but the survival of every man who trusted him enough to follow him into these unknown waters. The isolation of command, always present during any voyage, becomes almost crushing when the stakes are measured not in profit and loss, but in life and death. The sight of the Norwegian coast, when it finally appears through the morning mist, brings emotions too complex for simple words. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sadness, as if returning to the known world means losing something precious, found only in the unknown. The familiar headlands and harbours that once seemed like the entire world now appear small and limited, provincial by comparison with the vast spaces you've witnessed. Years later, when Ottar finds himself at the court of King Alfred in Wessex, his account of these voyages will be recorded by scribes who struggle to capture the reality of what he describes. Their words will preserve facts and distances and trade goods, but they cannot preserve the sensation of standing on a deck covered with ice while aurora borealis flickers overhead like green fire. They cannot convey the weight of silence in waters where no human voice has ever been heard. They cannot reproduce the particular quality of light that exists only in the high Arctic, where the sun skims along the horizon like a distant torch. But for those who sailed with him, no written record is needed. The memories are carved into their bodies by cold and effort and shared struggle. They carry within them the knowledge of what it means to push beyond the boundaries of the known world to survive in conditions that test the limits of human endurance, to return home with stories so extraordinary that they seem like dreams even to those who lived them. Ottar himself grows old in his hall in Halogaland, but his gaze still turns northward on winter evenings when the aurora dances across the sky. His hands, warming themselves at the fire, remember the weight of ice-crusted ropes. His ears, listening to the comfortable sounds of domestic life, still strain sometimes to catch the whisper of wind across pack ice. He has returned to the world of warmth and safety, but part of him remains forever in that other realm, sailing through waters that exist at the very edge of possibility. The men who sailed with him scatter to their own lives, their own hearths, their own stories, but they remain connected by shared knowledge of what lies beyond the familiar world. When they meet at markets or festivals, their conversations turn inevitably to that voyage, to details that grow more precious with each retelling. The colour of ice under midnight sun, the sound of whales singing beneath frozen seas, the taste of food shared with people whose names they never learned, but whose hospitality saved their lives. And sometimes, on nights when the wind carries the scent of snow and the promise of winter, they stand outside their warm halls and look northward toward waters that called to them once and might call again. They remember what it felt like to be small figures on an enormous sea, to navigate by stars that don't appear on southern charts, to trust their lives to the judgment of a man who chose curiosity over comfort and led them safely home through waters that had no names, until they gave them names by the simple act of survival. The aurora flickers green across the northern sky, and for a moment they are there again, aboard a ship that cuts through ice-dark water toward horizons that exist only for those brave enough to seek them. Let us now drift from the documented journeys of named explorers into the misty realm of half-remembered knowledge, where the line between history and legend grows as thin as ice forming on still water. Here, in this quiet space between the known and the unknowable, we encounter the deepest mysteries of how Viking seafarers navigated through the endless grey of Arctic winter, when the sun became a stranger and the familiar stars disappeared behind curtains of cloud and snow. Picture yourself standing on the deck of a ship, surrounded by overcast skies that have not broken for 7 days. The sun, if it exists at all in this white-wrapped world, remains hidden somewhere beyond layers of cloud, so thick they seem solid as stone. No shadows fall across the deck to indicate direction. No warmth touches your face to suggest the path of that invisible solar disk across the invisible sky. The wind shifts constantly, offering no reliable guidance. The waves, when you can see them through the fog, roll from every direction at once, their patterns confused by ice and current and the strange acoustics of Arctic air. This is the navigation challenge that faced Viking seafarers in the high latitudes during winter months, a puzzle so complex that modern sailors, even with magnetic compasses and electronic instruments, approach these waters with profound respect. How did men with wooden ships and iron tools find their way through this maze of mist and ice? How did they maintain course when every familiar reference point had been erased by weather and season? The answer, like so many answers from the distant past, comes to us in fragments and whispers, in archaeological hints and saga references that must be assembled like pieces of a puzzle where most of the pieces have been lost to time. Some of these fragments point toward knowledge so sophisticated that scholars still debate whether such techniques could actually have worked. Others suggest methods so simple and practical that we wonder why we ever doubted the ingenuity of people who staked their lives on the accuracy of their navigation. Consider the Sunstone, the solar stein mentioned in the Icelandic sagas, with the casual familiarity of a tool so common its workings needed no explanation. Modern researchers have identified it as likely being Iceland's spar, a form of crystalline calcite that exhibits a peculiar optical property called birefringence. When you hold a piece of Iceland spar up to the sky and rotate it slowly, it splits incoming light into two beams that behave differently depending on the direction of their source. Imagine yourself holding such a crystal on that grey morning we described, with clouds so thick they seem to press down upon the ship like a woolen blanket. The stone in your hand appears ordinary, clear as water, smooth as glass, no larger than your thumb. But as you raise it toward the featureless sky and begin to turn it slowly, something extraordinary happens. Through the crystal, you begin to see patterns in the seemingly uniform grayness above. Faint variations in brightness become visible, subtle differences in the polarization of light that your naked eye cannot detect. The technique, as described by those who have experimented with it, requires patience and practice. You must know how to orient the crystal, how to interpret the subtle changes in the light passing through it, how to correlate what you see with the actual position of that hidden sun. Some researchers claim it can pinpoint the sun's location to within 5 degrees even through heavy overcast. Others remain skeptical, arguing that such precision would require skills that seem almost supernatural. But perhaps supernatural is the wrong word. Perhaps what seems impossible to us, surrounded as we are by electronic aids and satellite signals, would have seemed perfectly natural to people who spent their lives reading the subtle signs that nature provides to those who know how to look. A sailor who has spent decades watching how light behaves on water, who has memorized the way clouds form and move in different weather patterns, who has trained his eyes to detect variations that most of us would never notice. Such a person might indeed be able to use a simple crystal to navigate with an accuracy that seems magical to landlubbers. The archaeological evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive. Pieces of Iceland's spar have been found in Viking-era contexts, but not in quantities or circumstances that prove navigational use. The crystal is fragile, easily lost overboard, quickly broken if dropped on a wooden deck. A tool so useful and so delicate might well have been carried in small quantities, carefully protected, used only when essential, which would explain its scarcity in the archaeological record. But the sunstone represents only one thread in a larger tapestry of navigation techniques that may have been far more sophisticated than surviving records suggest. Consider the evidence for celestial navigation using stars that remain visible even in Arctic conditions. The pole star, Polaris, maintains its position in the northern sky even when other stars are obscured by clouds or lost in the twilight that passes for day during polar winter. A navigator who could reliably identify Polaris could maintain a steady course, even in conditions that would leave modern sailors helpless. The techniques for finding and following Polaris in challenging conditions have been partially reconstructed from scattered references in saga literature and from the practices of other seafaring cultures that faced similar challenges. You learn to use your hand as a measuring device to calculate angles based on the width of fingers held at arm's length. You memorize the relationships between Polaris and other stars that are easier to spot. You develop an intuitive sense for the rhythm of stellar movement across the sky, so that even brief glimpses through breaking clouds can provide the information needed to verify or correct your course. But what of nights when even Polaris disappears behind unbroken overcast? What of the weeks-long periods when polar weather systems settle over the sea like a grey dome, blocking every celestial reference point? Here we enter even murkier waters, following hints and suggestions toward techniques that may have bordered on the mystical. Some evidence suggests that Viking navigators learned to read the subtle signs of land's presence long before any visible landmark appeared on the horizon. Clouds, for instance, behave differently over land than over open water. They form in different patterns, move at different speeds, carry different colors reflected from the surface below. A navigator trained to read these signs might detect the presence of an island or coastline while still dozens of miles from shore. The behavior of birds provides another layer of navigation information. Different species of seabirds have different feeding patterns, different flight ranges, different preferences for water temperature and depth. A navigator who had memorized these patterns could use bird sightings to estimate distance from shore, to identify the likely presence of fishing grounds or ice formations, to predict changes in weather or current. Even the water itself tells stories to those who know how to read them. Ocean swells behave predictably as they encounter obstacles like islands or ice sheets. The pattern of waves, their height and frequency and direction, creates a kind of fingerprint that can be read by experienced sailors. Polynesian navigators developed this technique to extraordinary levels of sophistication, and some evidence suggests that Viking seafarers may have employed similar methods, particularly in the relatively confined waters of the North Atlantic, where island chains create predictable patterns in wave behavior. The temperature and color and salinity of seawater change as you move from one current system to another, as you approach different types of coastline, as you enter regions where rivers discharge fresh water, or where ice formation affects the ocean's chemistry. A navigator with sufficient experience might taste the water, feel its temperature, observe its color, and from these subtle signs deduce his approximate location within the vast ocean. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Viking navigation involves the shipboard rituals that may have served practical as well as spiritual functions. The sagas mention offerings made to sea gods before dangerous passages, charms and amulets carried for protection, ceremonies performed at specific times during voyages. Modern scholars tend to dismiss these as superstition, but recent research suggests that such rituals might have served important psychological and practical functions. Consider the mental state required for successful navigation in challenging conditions. You must remain calm and focused while surrounded by potentially fatal dangers. You must make critical decisions based on incomplete information. You must maintain confidence in your abilities even when natural conditions seem designed to thwart every effort. The psychological pressure of such responsibility, particularly during extended voyages in harsh conditions, could easily overwhelm even experienced sailors. Ritual provides a framework for managing this psychological stress. The act of making offerings to sea gods might serve the practical function of forcing a navigator to pause, to review conditions carefully, to consider all available options before committing to a course of action. The recitation of traditional prayers or chants might help maintain mental focus during the long, monotonous hours of navigation. The physical presence of protective amulets might provide the confidence boost needed to make difficult decisions under pressure. Some of these rituals may have encoded practical information in forms that could be easily memorized and passed down across generations. Traditional songs often contain detailed information about navigation routes, safe harbors, seasonal wind patterns, and other essential knowledge. Stories that seem purely mythological sometimes prove, upon closer examination, to contain accurate descriptions of geographical features or natural phenomena. The runes carved into ship timbers and navigation instruments might represent more than mere decoration or magical protection. Some researchers suggest that certain runic inscriptions could have served as memory aids, encoding navigation information in symbolic form. The angular shapes of runic characters would remain clearly visible even when carved into wood exposed to salt water and harsh weather, making them ideal for preserving essential information in challenging conditions. But as we drift deeper into these mysteries, we must acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. The Vikings left no comprehensive manuals of seamanship, no detailed descriptions of navigation techniques, no technical treatises explaining their methods. What we know comes from scattered references in sagas written centuries after the fact, from archaeological artifacts whose original purposes can only be guessed, from comparisons with other seafaring cultures whose techniques may or may not have resembled those used in the North Atlantic. The silence surrounding these techniques may itself be significant. Navigation knowledge, particularly the kind of specialized expertise needed for Arctic voyaging, would have been extremely valuable. Masters of such techniques would have guarded their secrets carefully, passing them down only to chosen apprentices, sharing them only within trusted circles. The very survival of their communities might depend on maintaining advantages in seamanship and navigation that gave them access to resources unavailable to others. In this context, the fragmentary nature of our evidence becomes understandable. We are trying to reconstruct knowledge that was deliberately kept secret, techniques that were considered too valuable to risk losing through careless disclosure. The scattered hints that survive in saga literature and archaeological remains may represent only the most general aspects of a sophisticated knowledge system, the publicly acknowledged portions of expertise that included much deeper levels of understanding. As you stand on that fog-wrapped deck, holding your piece of Iceland spar up to the grey sky and hoping to catch some hint of the hidden sun's location, you become part of this ancient mystery. The crystal in your hand connects you to navigators who sailed these same waters centuries ago, who faced the same challenges of finding direction in a directionless world, who developed solutions that allowed them to cross vast oceanic distances with tools that modern technology has not yet fully understood. The aurora borealis flickers green across the northern sky, visible for brief moments through breaks in the overcast. Some ancient navigators may have learned to read even these ethereal lights, to interpret their movements and colors as signs pointing toward magnetic north, toward the invisible pole around which the entire celestial sphere appears to rotate. Modern science tells us that auroras are indeed aligned with magnetic field lines, that their behavior correlates with solar activity and atmospheric conditions in ways that could provide navigation information to those trained to read such signs. But perhaps the deepest mystery is not any specific technique or tool, but rather the state of mind that made such navigation possible, to sail confidently through fog and ice and perpetual twilight, to maintain course when every familiar reference point has vanished, to trust your life and the lives of your companions to methods that depend more on intuition than measurement. This requires a relationship with the natural world that most modern people have lost entirely. The Vikings who accomplished such feats were not superhuman, but they were the products of a culture that lived in constant, intimate contact with natural forces. They could not retreat into heated buildings when the weather turned harsh, could not rely on electronic instruments when visibility dropped to zero, could not call for rescue when their navigation failed. Their survival depended on developing senses and skills that we can barely imagine, on learning to read the subtle language that the ocean speaks to those who know how to listen. As the fog swirls around your ship and the hidden sun continues its invisible journey across the concealed sky, you close your eyes and try to feel what those ancient navigators felt. The slight change in the ship's motion that indicates a shift in current. The barely perceptible alteration in the sound of wind through the rigging that suggests changing weather. The subtle difference in the smell of the air that might indicate the presence of land beyond the horizon. These are the true mysteries of Viking navigation, not magical techniques or supernatural abilities, but ordinary human senses developed to extraordinary levels of sensitivity, supported by knowledge systems so sophisticated that we are still trying to understand how they worked. In the silence between waves, in the pause between one breath and the next, you listen for the ocean's whispered secrets, and for a moment you almost hear them. As we drift away from the mysteries of navigation and the whispered secrets of the sea, let us turn our attention to a different kind of mystery, the strange relationship between comfort and risk, between those who enjoy warmth and those who earn it through suffering. While sailors scrape ice from their rigging with numb fingers, Other lives unfold in chambers lined with furs, where the greatest hardship might be choosing which silver cup to drink from, where winter means not survival, but celebration. Picture, if you will, the great hall of Jarl Magnus in the Lofoten Islands on a night in deep winter, while somewhere far beyond the horizon, ships like the ones we've been aboard struggle through ice-dark waters toward uncertain destinations. Here the central hearth burns with logs thick as a man's waist, throwing heat and golden light up toward the smoke-stained beams of the roof. The fire never dies. There are always thralls to tend it, always dry wood stacked in careful piles, always someone awake to ensure that warmth continues its ancient battle against the cold pressing in from outside. Along the walls, tapestries woven from the finest wool hang like captured gardens, their patterns telling stories of heroes and gods and battles fought in warmer seasons. The colours, deep reds and forest greens and brilliant blues, seem to glow in the firelight, creating an atmosphere of richness that extends far beyond mere material wealth. These are not just decorations, but statements of power, demonstrations of resources so abundant that beauty can be afforded alongside necessity. The benches that line the hall are carved from oak aged to the colour of dark honey, their surfaces polished smooth by generations of use. Upon them lie cushions stuffed with down from northern geese, covered in silk that has travelled trade routes spanning half the world. Furs cascade from the benches to the floor, fox and marten and ermine, wolf and bear and seal, each pelt representing a story of hunt and trade, of wealth accumulated through the labour and risk of others. Jarl Magnus sits in his high seat, carved from a single massive piece of walrus ivory, and inlaid with silver, worked by craftsmen whose names have been forgotten, but whose skill echoes through the centuries. His clothing reflects the same casual abundance that characterizes his hall. His tunic is woven from wool so fine it feels like silk, dyed a deep blue that speaks of merchants who have journeyed to distant lands and returned with precious indigo. Over this he wears a cloak of polar bear fur, white as fresh snow and soft as a whispered prayer, clasped at the shoulder with a brooch of gold worked into intricate patterns that seem to shift and dance in the firelight. But Magnus is not alone in his comfortable isolation. Around him, his household gathers in a carefully orchestrated display of hierarchy and abundance. His wife Astrid sits nearby on a chair of carved whalebone, her dress rustling with the whisper of silk embroidered with silver thread. Her hair, braided with ribbons of finest linen, is held in place by combs carved from walrus ivory and decorated with garnets that catch the light like drops of frozen blood. The keys hanging from her belt are not mere tools, but symbols of authority, each one wrought from silver and representing her control over the household stores of grain and mead and preserved meats. Their children play games carved from amber and bone, their laughter ringing through the hall with the pure sound of beings who have never known true want, never experienced the bone-deep cold that turns breath to crystal and makes every moment a negotiation with survival. They are dressed in miniature versions of their parents' finery, wool dyed in expensive colors, furs selected for softness rather than durability, silver ornaments that proclaim their status before they are old enough to understand what status means. The retainers who serve the family occupy their own carefully defined positions in this warm ecosystem. The skald, the keeper of stories and singer of praise songs, holds a place of honor near the fire, his lyre strung with silver wire, his memory filled with genealogies and heroic deeds that stretch back through generations. He speaks of voyages to distant lands, of battles fought and won, of treasures gathered from the edges of the world, but his knowledge comes from words, not experience. He has never felt ice form on his eyelashes, never tasted the desperation that comes with dwindling food supplies in the middle of an endless ocean. The weaponsmith works at his bench near the hearth, shaping iron that glows like captured starlight, creating blades that will be wielded by others in situations he will never face. His hammers ring against the anvil in rhythms as regular as heartbeats, forging spear points and sword edges that will taste salt spray and frozen blood while he remains surrounded by warmth and safety. The irony is lost on him that his most beautiful creations are destined for the ugliest work, that the weapons he lavishes with decorative scrollwork and precious metals will end their existence stained with rust and battle grime in the hands of men who have no time to admire their artistry. The food that appears on the long tables tells its own story of abundance and distance. Bread baked from wheat that grew in southern fields, carried northward by traders who risked storms and pirates to deliver grain to tables that have never known shortage. Meat from cattle that grazed in protected valleys, tended by thralls who ensured that the Jarl's table would never lack for fresh flesh, even in the depths of winter. Fish caught in nets worked by men who sleep in draughty bothies and eat barley gruel, but whose labour fills the plates of people who can afford to be selective about which portions of the catch they will consume. The ale flows from barrels coopered by craftsmen whose names are unknown, but whose skill ensures that fermentation continues its ancient alchemy even in the coldest weather. The mead, thick as liquid gold and twice as precious, sweetens tongues that have never known the harsh taste of sea salt and dried fish, that have never been forced to chew leather when food supplies run low. Each cup raised in toast represents resources that could keep a ship's crew fed for days, luxuries that exist because somewhere someone else accepts hardship as the price of another's comfort. But even in this paradise of warmth and abundance, the sea makes its presence felt in subtle ways. The amber that decorates the Jarl's drinking horn was once tree resin, fossilized in primeval forests, then washed from ancient shores by waves that continue their patient work of reshaping the world. The walrus ivory that frames doorways and decorates furniture speaks of creatures that live and die in waters so cold they can kill a man in minutes, harvested by hunters who risk everything for the privilege of selling luxury to those who will never face such risks themselves. The silver that glints from every surface, arm rings and brooches and decorated weapons, much of it comes from distant lands carried by traders who navigate by stars and instinct through waters that appear on no reliable maps. Each ounce of precious metal represents voyages taken and survived, storms weathered, and pirates evaded, the accumulated risks of dozens of men transformed into objects of beauty that will never leave the safety of this warm hall. The spices that flavor the evening meal, pepper that burns the tongue with exotic fire, cinnamon that carries the scent of faraway forests. These too are the products of journeys that span continents and oceans, carried in the holds of ships that face the same challenges of ice and storm and navigation that we have been witnessing. But here, in the comfort of the hall, they appear as if by magic, their origins forgotten in the pleasure of their taste. As you sit in this hall, for surely you have earned a place here after all your imagined suffering, you feel the strange dislocation that comes from sudden transitions between hardship and comfort. Your hands, which moments ago were stiff with cold and raw from handling frozen ropes, now wrap around a silver cup, warm from the fire. Your body, which has grown accustomed to the constant motion of ship deck beneath your feet, now rests on cushions so soft they seem to embrace you. Your ears, attuned to the whisper of wind through rigging and the hiss of spray across gunwales, now hear the gentle crackle of burning logs and the soft murmur of conversation conducted in voices that have never had to shout over the sound of storms. The contrast is so stark it almost seems unreal, as if you have passed through some magical barrier between two different worlds. In one world, survival is a daily negotiation with forces that care nothing for human wants or needs. In the other, comfort is so taken for granted that its absence becomes literally unimaginable. The people around you in this hall are not cruel or indifferent to the sufferings of those who make their comfort possible. They simply exist in a reality where such sufferings are abstract concepts rather than lived experiences. The Jarl himself occasionally speaks of the voyages that bring wealth to his household, but his words carry the detached quality of someone describing events that happen to other people in distant places. He knows that ships sail through dangerous waters to reach trading centers where furs and amber and walrus ivory can be exchanged for silver and spices and fine cloth. He understands that men die in the service of such enterprises, that ships are lost to storms and ice and navigational errors. But this knowledge sits in his mind like information learned from books, rather than wisdom earned through experience. When Magnus raises his cup to toast the safe return of a trading expedition, his gesture acknowledges the risks involved, but from the comfortable distance of someone who has never felt those risks personally. The sailors who actually faced the storms, who actually navigated through ice-choked channels, who actually went weeks eating frozen fish and melted snow, these men received their share of the profits and their moment of recognition. But the real celebration belongs to those who financed the expedition while remaining safely at home. The women of the household occupy their own complex position in this hierarchy of comfort and risk. Astrid, the Jarl's wife, commands resources that represent the labor and danger of hundreds of people she will never meet. Her silk dress speaks of trade routes that span continents, her silver jewelry of mines worked by slaves in distant mountains, her ivory combs of Arctic hunts conducted in conditions that would kill her within hours. Yet her power within the household is real and substantial. She controls the distribution of food and goods, manages the complex social relationships that hold the community together, makes decisions that affect the lives of everyone under her roof. The serving women and thrall women who attend her live in the same warm halls, but occupy a different relationship to the luxury around them. They touch the silk and silver daily, but as caretakers rather than owners. They prepare the exotic foods, but eat simpler fare themselves. They tend the fires that keep the hall warm, but sleep in corners where the heat barely reaches. Their comfort is real but conditional, dependent on the continued prosperity of those they serve. The children growing up in this environment learn to take abundance for granted in ways that would be incomprehensible to the children of sailors or farmers or craftsmen. They play with toys carved from ivory and amber, wear clothes dyed with pigments worth their weight in silver, eat foods that have traveled thousands of miles to reach their plates. Their greatest hardships involve lessons in deportment and the memorization of genealogies. Their most dangerous adventures consist of supervised hunting expeditions in carefully managed forests. Yet even they are not entirely insulated from the realities that support their comfort. They hear the stories told by skalds, tales of heroes who venture into dangerous lands and face terrible monsters and win great treasures through courage and cunning. These stories serve partially as entertainment, but they also function as a kind of cultural education, teaching the children that their comfortable lives rest upon a foundation of risk and struggle undertaken by others. The religious observances that punctuate life in the hall reflect this same complex relationship between comfort and danger. Prayers are offered to gods who govern the sea and weather. Rituals are performed to ensure the safety of voyages and the success of trading expeditions. But these ceremonies take place in warm, safe spaces, conducted by people who are asking for protection of enterprises they will not personally undertake. The gods being appealed to, Njörður of the sea, Odin the far wanderer, Thor who battles the forces of chaos, are themselves figures who embody the active, dangerous aspects of existence that the hall's inhabitants prefer to experience only through stories and prayers. As the evening deepens and the fire burns lower, conversation in the hall turns increasingly to plans and possibilities for the coming sailing season. Maps are consulted, not the practical charts that working navigators might use, but decorative objects that show the world in stylized forms suitable for display rather than navigation. Tales are told of distant lands where extraordinary profits await those brave enough to seek them. Investments are discussed, partnerships are proposed, expeditions are planned by people who will never feel the spray of foreign seas on their faces. But even as these comfortable people make their comfortable plans, somewhere beyond their warm walls, ships continue their patient struggle through waters that turn men's breath to ice and test every skill they possess. The juxtaposition is not lost on you as you sit between these two worlds, the world of those who risk everything and the world of those who risk nothing, the world of frozen ropes and stale bread, and the world of silk tapestries and honeyed mead. Both worlds are fragile in their own ways. A single storm can sink the ships that carry the trade goods that maintain the hall's prosperity. A single raid can burn the hall and scatter its inhabitants to fates worse than any faced by voluntary seafarers. The sea that provides opportunity also poses eternal threats. The wealth that creates comfort also attracts enemies. The very success that allows such luxury also creates dependencies that can become fatal vulnerabilities. As you warm your hands at the fire and taste wine that has traveled further than most people will ever journey, you carry within yourself the memory of ice and cold and the endless, patient work of survival. The contrast makes both experiences more vivid, the comfort more precious because you remember its absence, the remembered hardship more meaningful because you now understand what it purchases. The aurora borealis flickers green outside the hall's shuttered windows, visible to those who choose to brave the cold night air. Inside, the fire burns steady and warm, its light falling on faces that have never seen their breath freeze in the air, that have never felt the desperation of searching grey skies for any hint of the hidden sun. Both realities exist simultaneously in the same world, separated by nothing more substantial than walls of wood and stone, connected by bonds of mutual dependence that neither side fully understands. Tomorrow, perhaps, new ships will arrive at the harbour, their crews stiff with cold and exhaustion, carrying cargoes that will disappear into warm halls where they will be transformed into objects of beauty and symbols of status. And other ships will depart, carrying the hopes and investments of comfortable people toward horizons that exist only as abstractions in their minds, manned by sailors who understand exactly what such journeys cost in comfort and safety and peace of mind. The cycle continues as it has for generations, the eternal dance between risk and reward, between those who venture into danger and those who profit from their courage, between the cold seas that test human endurance and the warm halls that make such testing seem worthwhile. And now, as our journey through these frozen waters draws toward its close, let us allow the ship of our imagination to drift slowly back toward familiar shores, back toward the warmth of our own time, our own comfort, our own safety. The ice that has clung to our rigging begins to melt in the growing light. The frost that has decorated our thoughts with silver patterns starts to fade. The cold that has been our constant companion for these long hours gradually releases its hold on our senses. But something remains. Something always remains when you have traveled, even in imagination, to places where survival is not guaranteed, where comfort cannot be taken for granted, where the simple act of seeing another sunrise requires effort and skill and the kind of quiet courage that most of us will never need to summon. You carry with you now a different understanding of warmth, not just the absence of cold, but a positive force, a gift, a luxury that would have seemed miraculous to those frost-bitten sailors scraping ice from their oars in waters where the sun forgot to shine. Feel the warmth around you now, the controlled climate that keeps your space comfortable without thought or effort, the electric lights that banish darkness at the touch of a switch, the layers of insulation and heating systems and architectural design that create islands of comfort in what is still, beneath all our technology, the same challenging world that tested our Viking seafarers. We have not conquered cold or eliminated winter, or made the seas less dangerous. We have simply learned to insulate ourselves so thoroughly from these challenges that we sometimes forget they exist at all. But tonight, for these quiet hours, you have remembered. You have felt, through the magic of imagination and the careful crafting of words, what it might have been like to live closer to the edge, to depend on knowledge and skill and endurance rather than technology and convenience. You have experienced, in the safety of your warm space, something of what it meant to be truly responsible for your own survival, to understand that comfort is earned rather than expected, to know that the difference between life and death could come down to reading the wind correctly or treating your tools with proper care. The men who lived these experiences, who actually felt ice forming in their beards, who actually tasted the desperation of diminishing food supplies, who actually navigated by stars and instinct through waters that could kill them, these men are gone now, vanished into the vast anonymity of time. Their names, for the most part, are forgotten. Their individual stories have been absorbed into the larger narrative of human exploration and survival, and the endless quest for something better beyond the horizon. But their knowledge echoes still in the techniques passed down through generations of sailors, in the accumulated wisdom that allows modern navigators to cross oceans with confidence, in the very fact that humans learn to see the sea not as a barrier, but as a pathway to distant possibilities. Every time someone ventures beyond the familiar in search of something new, they honor the memory of those anonymous sailors who first showed that such ventures were possible. Ottar of Halogaland, whose name we do know, whose story survived in the chronicles of King Alfred's court, represents thousands of others whose curiosity overcame their caution, whose desire for knowledge and profit and adventure proved stronger than their attachment to safety and comfort. His voyages into the Arctic waters opened pathways that others would follow, established relationships that would endure for generations, proved that the northern seas were not impassable barriers but navigable routes to valuable destinations. The mysteries we explored, the sunstones and star navigation and weather reading and all the subtle skills that allowed navigation without instruments, these represent a different kind of relationship with the natural world than most of us maintain today. We have gained much through our technological sophistication, our electronic instruments, our satellite navigation systems that can pinpoint our location to within meters. But we have also lost something, that intimate knowledge of natural signs, that ability to read the subtle language that the ocean speaks to those who know how to listen. Perhaps that loss is acceptable, perhaps the trade-off is worthwhile, safety and convenience in exchange for the kind of direct engagement with natural forces that our ancestors took for granted. But there is value in remembering, occasionally, what that engagement felt like, what it cost, what it made possible. There is value in understanding that our comfortable, climate-controlled, electronically navigated world rests upon a foundation of knowledge and experience, and hard-won wisdom accumulated by people who had no choice but to develop such intimate relationships with their environment. The contrast between sailor and jarl, between those who risk everything and those who enjoy the fruits of such risks, remains relevant in our own time. We are all, in various ways, beneficiaries of enterprises we do not personally undertake, consumers of goods and services produced by people whose names we do not know, whose struggles we do not witness, whose sacrifices we barely acknowledge. The silk that came from distant lands to warm a Viking hall has its modern equivalent in the countless products that appear in our stores with no visible connection to the complex global networks that bring them to us. But there is also something hopeful in this ancient story of winter navigation and survival. It reminds us that humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation, that we can develop skills and knowledge systems that allow us to thrive in conditions that would seem impossible to endure. It suggests that curiosity and determination and the willingness to accept risk can open pathways to possibilities that we cannot imagine from the safety of familiar shores. The aurora that flickered green across northern skies 1,000 years ago continues to dance through the polar darkness, following the same magnetic patterns, responding to the same solar influences, painting the same ethereal light across waters that still challenge those who venture into them. The stars that guided Viking navigators through Arctic nights shine with the same light on modern travelers who choose to venture beyond the reach of electronic aids. The ocean that tested ancient sailors with ice and storm and endless grey continues to offer the same tests to anyone bold enough to accept them. As you settle into whatever rest awaits you now, carry with you the memory of ice melting in sunlight, of ships finding their way across trackless waters, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because circumstances required them to exceed their own expectations. Let the rhythm of waves against wooden hulls carry you towards sleep. Let the whisper of wind through rigging sing you toward dreams. Let the knowledge that humans have always found ways to navigate safely home provide whatever comfort you need for the journey ahead. The ships we have sailed together in imagination are drawn up on the beach now, their voyages complete, their crews dispersed to warm halls and comfortable beds and the embrace of families who welcome them home with relief and celebration. The ice has melted from their rigging. The salt has been scrubbed from their decks. The stories of their journeys have begun their own voyages, passing from mouth to mouth, changing and growing with each retelling, becoming part of the great collection of human experience that teaches us what is possible when necessity and courage and skill combine in the service of dreams. Rest well, fellow traveller. You have earned your comfort through this night's journey to places where comfort could not be taken for granted. You have touched, however briefly, the experience of those who ventured beyond the familiar in search of something worth the risks they accepted. You have remembered, in the warmth and safety of your own time and place, what earlier generations knew in their bones, that the world is large and challenging and full of wonders that reveal themselves only to those willing to leave familiar shores behind. The aurora fades with the approaching dawn. The sea grows calm under clearing skies. The ancient rhythms of tide and season and stellar movement continue their eternal dance, indifferent to human comfort, responsive only to forces far greater than any individual life. But within those vast patterns there is always room for the small, persistent efforts of humans who refuse to be limited by the boundaries of the familiar, who choose exploration over safety, who discover that the edge of the known world is never as final as it appears from a distance. Sleep now and dream of fair winds and following seas, of ice that melts and fog that clears, of stars that shine bright enough to guide you home from whatever distant shores your own dreams may carry you toward. The journey continues as it always has, as it always will, carried forward by the quiet courage of ordinary people who choose to venture beyond the horizon in search of whatever extraordinary possibilities await those bold enough to seek them. In the silence between waves, in the pause between one breath and the next, the sea whispers its ancient promise that those who trust themselves to its keeping, who learn to read its signs and respect its power, who approach it with skill and humility and patience, will find that it carries them not toward destruction, but toward transformation, not toward endings, but toward new beginnings that they could never have imagined from the safety of familiar shores. The tide turns, the wind freshens, the voyage home begins. If this slow journey through frozen history helped you find rest tonight, you're not alone out there in the quiet darkness. These ancient rhythms of sea and season and the patient work of navigation continue to flow beneath our modern world, connecting us to every generation of travelers who have trusted themselves to uncertain waters in search of something worth the risk of leaving home behind. Until our paths cross again in these late-night wanderings through time, rest well and remember, the aurora still dances, the stars still shine, and the sea still calls to those whose hearts are ready to answer. As tonight's story fades, thank you for listening. I share new quiet walks through history almost every day, so you're always welcome back. There's a fresh tale waiting below, or you can subscribe to stay with our nighttime family. Sweet dreams.